I know there's going to be a lot of outraged and offended responses to this movie. The political left will call Kubrick a fascist, and the right, well, who knows? Honestly, I've never heard Stanley Kubrick called a fascist. His film, Full Metal Jacket, which his co-writer thought would earn him this reputation, has almost universally been seen as critical of the government, rather than supportive of it. Academics have called it the ultimate anti-war film, a film about the abuse of young men. Drafted against their wills into a war that has nothing to do with them, they are indoctrinated and transformed into killing machines by a tyrannical drill sergeant. One man is so abused that his life ends in the ultimate tragedy. The men who survive are turned into sadists, automata who can only engage with the world through rote phrases that were driven into them in boot camp. And many of them perish in a war they wanted nothing to do with. In the end, it seems there is no deeper understanding of the world, no lessons learned, no character development, just pessimism. This seems to be the general consensus regarding the film's meaning. The only problem is that this is not what Kubrick or the film's writers actually said about their film. When we turn away from the conjectural interpretations imposed on the film by liberal critics and look at the comments made by the authors, we see a far more complicated story. A story where even the darkest elements of human nature are not meant to be protested per se, but to be recognized, not only as being inevitable, but even necessary and, dare we say it, good. And rather than meaningless pessimism, the film offers one of the most sophisticated depictions of what the psychologist Carl Jung called individuation, the central task of life, which involves becoming an independent individual who not only stands out from the crowd, but who is awake to himself, his own life and mind, and to the world around him. An individual who participates in an ever-recurring cycle of renewed growth and human completeness. Not in the tranquility of a pain-free paradise or a happy utopia, but in the darkest of realities, which human beings most vehemently try to avoid, but all too often foolishly stumble into. When Kubrick was asked about R. Lee Ermey, who plays a Marine drill instructor tasked with turning men into killing machines, a character who is often seen as a kind of villain, Kubrick noted that Ermey had been a real Marine drill instructor on Parris Island, going on to say, quote, "Aside from the insults, virtually every serious thing he says is basically true. When he says, a rifle is only a tool, it's a hard heart that kills, you know it's true. Unless you're living in a world that doesn't need fighting men, you can't fault him. Except maybe for a certain lack of subtlety in his behavior, and I don't think the United States Marine Corps is in the market for subtle drill instructors." It's interesting to hear Kubrick himself say that you can't fault Hartman when so many film reviewers do just that. And if it is true that there's a place for hard-hearted killing, then even if you do think that this is a kind of indoctrination, well, the film's director, for one, said that the things which are being indoctrinated are basically true. Maybe this is why Kubrick's co-writer on Full Metal Jacket, Michael Herr, said that the American left would call Kubrick a fascist. Of course, the film was not meant to be pro-government. Kubrick always maintained that the film was neither pro-war nor anti-war, but simply designed to show the reality of it. Of course, it did just so happen that part of that reality did involve showing how communists on the political left ordered civilians to show up for re-education, which is dystopian in and of itself, only to then murder those civilians in the street. Although, when we remember that the film also shows an American killing civilians, then it becomes clear that Full Metal Jacket is not so much about political ideology as it is about the deeper, darker side of human nature, which is shared by all, and which comes out most horrifically in mankind's most primal conflicts, an idea that does not bode well for utopian fantasies of world peace and social justice. As Herr said, quote, "The substance of the film was single-minded. The old and always serious problem of how you put into a film or a book the living, behaving presence of what Jung called the shadow. the most accessible of archetypes, and the easiest to experience. War is the ultimate field of shadow activity, where all of its other activities lead you. Many will hear this and think that the shadow is the evil side of human nature, and therefore, war must be the ultimate arena of evil. However, it's not so simple. While the idea that there is a light side and a dark side to human beings is as old as the oral traditions of Genesis, the more modern idea of the shadow that was first articulated by Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung is not about good and evil per se. Indeed, Jung made the rather daunting assertion that the darkness that is in every human being is not necessarily bad. And even if we could get rid of our shadow, we shouldn't, because the shadow, while always being unpleasant, is actually capable of doing good, as well as doing evil. Quote, "Just as the serpent stands for the power that heals as well as corrupts, so likewise the shadow is on one side regrettable and reprehensible weakness, on the other side healthy instinctivity, and the prerequisite for higher consciousness. If it has been believed hitherto that the human shadow was the source of all evil, it can now be ascertained on closer investigation that the unconscious man, that is, his shadow, does not consist only of morally reprehensible tendencies, but also displays a number of good qualities, such as normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, and creative impulses. Thus, part of the process of becoming a complete individual means, quote, allowing our shadow tendencies some measure of realization, tempered, of course, with the necessary criticism. Yes, we are meant to temper some of our dark inclinations, tuning them and balancing them with life, while also finding ways to integrate the more unpleasant parts of ourselves, like disobedience or even harshness, into our conscious personalities. Though what is perhaps most difficult for people to swallow is that this includes the willingness to kill, even to kill without mercy, which is, in a sense, what Full Metal Jacket is about. Whether or not you agree with Carl Jung's ideas, as far as screenwriter Michael Herr is concerned, in the film world of Full Metal Jacket, Carl Jung's theory of human nature is true.
You write "born to kill" on your helmet and you wear a peace button. What's that supposed to be, some kind of sick joke?
No, sir.
What is it supposed to mean?
I think I was trying to suggest something about the duality of man, sir.
The what?
The duality of man, the Jungian thing, sir.
Whose side are you on, son?
This is Sergeant Joker, who is the closest thing to a protagonist which the film has. Throughout Full Metal Jacket, Joker is good-natured, affable, and at times almost motherly. Through his sarcastic prodding, we get some of the most serrated criticisms of the Vietnam War, yet there are times when his dark side also appears, and it's not very pretty. Although there are other times when his shadow in the form of rebellion and disobedience does actually get him promoted, which puts him in a position to help someone who is in need, which demonstrates Jung's point that while the shadow is always unpleasant, it is not always immoral per se. Damnation and salvation are its left and right hands. And when you try to put that idea on screen, the result will be a film that has no easy interpretation. As Michael Herr said, quote, "The moral and political trellises are down, with all the rhetoric that grew on them." The audience would not be told how to watch this movie. This would be what the studios used to call a who do you root for movie. Non-explicit in its meanings, low road in its production, minimal in expression, highly specific, like Hemingway, simple surface, long reverberations. Watching Full Metal Jacket without rooting for or against any one character reveals deeper levels of complexity inside each man, which can be enjoyable to uncover as well as frustrating. Take, for example, Private Leonard Lawrence, who has been drafted into the Marine Corps and, along with his fellow recruits, is given a new name by the abrasive Marine drill instructor. Leonard is given the name Private Gomer Pyle, partly because of the foolish look on his face as well as his mental slowness. Leonard is typically seen as the iconic victim of the film, and it's certainly easy to sympathize with him, at least in the beginning. We see him fail again and again, and we want him to succeed. The fact that he is treated harshly, verbally and physically abused, makes us pity him all the more. And when he ultimately takes his own life, many people blame Hartman and his beloved Corps, along with the crooked government on top of them, for drafting and tyrannizing a psychologically vulnerable young man. For others, like myself and Carl Jung, Lawrence's downfall is not so simple. For example, by the time he starts stealing food from the mess hall or saying that he cannot properly dress himself, I mean, come on, he can't dress himself? It's starting to seem like Leonard bears some responsibility for his own failings, even if he's not aware of it. And this is a point which Carl Jung made, saying, quote, "It is often tragic to see how blatantly a man bungles his own life and the lives of others, yet remains totally incapable of seeing how much of the whole tragedy originates in himself, and how he continually feeds it and keeps it going. Not consciously, of course. For consciously, he is engaged in bewailing and cursing a faithless world that recedes further and further into the distance. Rather, it is an unconscious factor which spins the illusions that veil his world. And what is being spun is a cocoon, which in the end will completely envelop him." Now, obviously, there are times when we all stumble in life, we fail and we need help. Even Hartman recognizes this when he assigns Joker to help Pyle succeed where he is failing. And Joker is able to help Leonard over the tower obstacle that previously crippled him with fear. But does Leonard really need help dressing himself? Does he need someone to stop him from stealing dessert from the mess in order to satiate his hunger? How exactly did Leonard function before being drafted into the Marines? I guess you could argue that Hartman's verbal abuse and his public shaming has broken Leonard's mind so that he's less and less mentally capable. The only problem with this is that we eventually do see that Leonard is capable of doing everything the Marine Corps wants him to do. He does eventually achieve mastery as a recruit, although significantly, Leonard only snaps into shape after he has had a psychologically traumatic experience. When Sergeant Hartman decides to punish the whole squad every time Leonard fails, and when Leonard keeps failing, the squad decides to punish him, probably out of desperation in an effort to end their own suffering, but probably also out of a sense of something darker, perhaps an instinct for vengeance. During the night, the squad beats him with bars of soap wrapped in towels. And even Private Joker, who up to this point has almost been like a mother to Pyle, goes along with the beating. And in fact, he beats Leonard more harshly than anyone else. From Joker's perspective, his kindness has only been repaid with more failings from Leonard, and more punishment. It's like Leonard isn't even trying. And the more help he gets, the more help he demands.
I can't do anything right. I need help.
I'm trying to help you, Leonard. I'm really trying.
This is really the first time in the film that we see the two-sided nature of our characters. In fact, the whole physical environment changes to signal the appearance of the darker side of the self, as if we are now in a full-blown horror film. From the music to the lighting, this scene seems separated from the rest of the movie, outside of its time and space, reflecting what Carl Jung said of the shadow. It is, quote, an archaic, eternal, and ubiquitous dream state. Of course, it's not just Joker's shadow that shows up at this point, it's Leonard's. After this moment, something in Private Lawrence breaks. He is no longer as doe-eyed as his adopted namesake. He looks like he is forever gazing into something truly horrifying. But what's really interesting is that from this moment on, he is no longer incompetent. We never see him fail. In fact, he becomes ultra-competent, surpassing even Private Joker.
Private Pyle, you are definitely born again hard. Hell, I may even allow you to serve as a rifleman in my beloved corps.
On the one hand, this proves that Pyle hasn't been failing because he was incapable. We now see that he is capable, and he had the necessary capabilities within him the whole time. But oddly enough, his competence seems to have everything to do with his Jungian shadow. Carl Jung would say that Pyle has actually become possessed by his own shadow, a word which drives home the gravity of what has happened. It's important to realize that for Carl Jung, the shadow is not just about our dark potential, the unsavory things that we might do. On the contrary, the shadow is active within us right now and at all times, particularly in the realm of the unconscious. And even though we might not be aware of it, it has instincts and impulses which try to drive our behavior. Now, Carl Jung used different words to characterize this inner turmoil, saying that the unconscious contents of our minds, quote, have an emotional nature, a kind of autonomy, and accordingly an obsessive or better, possessive quality. On this lower level, with its uncontrolled or scarcely controlled emotions, one behaves more or less like a primitive, who is not only the passive victim of his affects, but also singularly incapable of moral judgment. Leonard is now dominated by these primitive characteristics. His mind is colored from top to bottom by the archaic nature of the unconscious. And this is something that we can see in Leonard's face. He does not seem to be present. He's not in the here and now because, as Jung said, the shadow exists in the psychically relative space-time continuum that is characteristic of the unconscious as such. If the shadow is, as Jung said, an archaic, eternal, ubiquitous dream state, we might say that Leonard is sleepwalking, dreaming while awake, and his dreams are truly dark. Rather than critically assessing his own actions in the light of accepted behavioral norms, Leonard seems to live compulsively and obsessively, to train, to fight, and to kill.
The drill instructors are proud to see that we are growing beyond their control. The Marine Corps does not want robots. The Marine Corps wants killers. The Marine Corps wants to build indestructible men, men without fear.
The Marine Corps wants to create men who are beyond their control, and they have done just that. On the last night on Paris Island, when the recruits have graduated from basic training and finally become Marines, we return to the shadowy dream world. Private Joker is on fire watch when he discovers Leonard in the bathroom, loading an M14 rifle. When Leonard starts reciting his Marine catechism,
"This is my rifle! There are many like it, but this one is mine!"
Hartman storms into the bathroom, still haranguing Private Pyle, only to have Leonard shoot him before turning the rifle on himself, while Joker is left to watch. The fact that Leonard chooses to spare Private Joker is somewhat odd. After all, Leonard became possessed by his shadow only after Joker had beaten him with the rest of the squad, which led directly to where Leonard is right now, finding himself in what he sees to be a hopeless world where nothing is right, and where he cannot possibly go on living. Yet, Leonard does not take revenge on Joker, even though he does seem to be taking revenge on Hartman. And maybe it's because Joker's kindness, understanding, and gentle manner are powerful enough to offset that one act of brutality, causing Leonard to spare Joker. In other words, it's Joker's light side that ultimately saves his life. This critical duality between light and dark follows Joker to Vietnam, where he has become a war correspondent for Stars and Stripes, On the one hand, Joker says that he's anxious to get back into action, which is exactly what the Shadow would want. However, his comrades think that Joker doesn't really mean it. He's faking it. In fact, they don't think he's been in the true darkness of combat at all. He doesn't have the stare.
The 1,000-yard stare. It's like you're really seen beyond.
Furthermore, when the enemy does unexpectedly attack, Joker says that he isn't ready for it.
I hope they're just f***ing with us. I ain't ready for this. Amen.
Which confirms for us that deep down, Joker does not really want to be in the horrors of combat. So while he is partially in touch with his shadow, enough to make him punish Leonard and stand up to Sergeant Hartman, he has not integrated his unconscious shadow as much as many of the other soldiers in Vietnam. For example, when Joker is sent on assignment to the front lines, he encounters a chopper gunner who guns down women and children without a flutter of conscience.
How can you shoot women and children?
Easy. You just don't lead them so much. Ain't war hell?
A quintessential shadow figure who sees the killing of civilians as a grand joke. In fact, for many of the troops in Vietnam, warfare is just that, a joke. Take, for example, Crazy Earl, who invites Rafterman to take a picture of what seems to be a sleeping soldier, but which turns out to be a dead in VA, which the squad seems to be keeping around as a sick joke. With sarcasm as thick and sweet as molasses, Crazy Earl says that he loves the NVA, who are as hard as drill instructors. And after the American soldiers rotate back home, they're going to miss having people to shoot. The idea of shooting drill instructors might remind us of Pyle and Hartman. Although for men like Crazy Earl, Vietnam is not the ultimate nightmare, it's the ultimate party.
This is his party. He's the guest of honor. Today is his birthday.
An idea which is reinforced by the pop music blasting in the background. You could almost start to think that war is kind of fun. One of the many great moments in the film is the scene which follows, when the platoon, which has been marching behind some tanks, is suddenly attacked. It's a remarkably tense moment. Crazy Earl takes over, leading the men into the rubble, accompanied by ominous drumming. It feels like anything can happen, and it's just really great filmmaking. But the moment that Crazy Earl finally manages to kill a few fleeing enemy soldiers, the tension is gone and the party is back in full swing.
Well, everybody's heard about the bird.
Kubrick said that the music suggests post-combat euphoria, quote, which you see in the Marine's face when he fires at the men running out of the building. He misses the first 4, waits a beat, then hits the next 2. And that great look on his face, that look of euphoric pleasure, the pleasure one has read described in so many accounts of combat. Men like Crazy Earl were made for Vietnam.
Do I think America belongs in Vietnam? I don't know. I belong in Vietnam. I'll tell you that.
Other men like Cowboy hate Vietnam.
I hate Vietnam. There's not one horse in this whole country. They don't have one horse in Vietnam. There's something basically wrong with that.
And some of the men outright criticized the war, complaining that their own freedom was taken away in order to try and give freedom to people who don't want it. Still, most of the men retain a comedic outlook through and through. They recognize that the war itself is a joke.
I mean, we're getting killed for these people and they don't even appreciate it. They think it's a big joke.
The notable exception to this humorous outlook is Animal Mother. For him, everything seems to be deadly serious.
Well, they call me the Joker.
Well, I got a joke for you. I'm gonna tear you a new asshole.
Whether he likes war or not is immaterial. His only concern is ultimate victory.
What do I think about America's involvement in the war? Well, I think we should win.
The interesting thing about Joker is that he does talk like these men, saying in front of the camera that he wants to kill people.
I wanted to meet interesting and stimulating people of an ancient culture and kill them. I wanted to be the first kid on my block to get a confirmed kill.
But psychologically, Joker is not really like these other men. He talks the talk, but he doesn't walk the walk. These men have all tapped into their shadows in some form or another. But Joker, by contrast, is suppressing his shadow, which we can infer not only from Joker's queasiness about war and his failure to live up to the way he talks, but also his sense of superiority over the men around him, which usually manifests itself as verbal jousting. He's not willing to challenge people outright or flaunt his sense of superiority outwardly. Rather, he veils his disagreements in sarcasm and humor, as when he spars with his superior at Stars and Stripes.
Sir, maybe you should go out on some ops yourself. I'm sure you could find a lot more blood trails and drag marks.
Lieutenant Lockhart is not a good person. While he's not bloodthirsty, he does represent the bureaucratic side of the military and the press, which continuously lied about the Vietnam War, and which led Kubrick to say that, quote, Vietnam was such a phony war, in terms of the hawkish technocrats fine-tuning the facts like an ad agency, talking of kill ratios and Hamlet pacification, and encouraging men to falsify a body count or at least total up the blood trails on the supposition that they would lead to bodies. We like to see Joker call out this kind of dishonesty and prod the lieutenant for engaging in it. The problem is that, practically speaking, Joker is not much different from the lieutenant. As a willing subordinate, Joker still writes whatever Lieutenant Lockhart tells him to. So long as he obeys those orders, he is really criticizing himself, though he doesn't seem to realize it. He can see someone else's faults, someone else's shadow, but not his own. Carl Jung would likely say that Joker is suffering from something that he called inflation, which is something that can happen when a person suppresses their shadow and, quote, the self consequently becomes assimilated to the ego. In his book Aion, Jung described inflation as basically the inverse of shadow possession, which you may remember is what happened to Private Pyle. When a person is inflated, they are dominated by the conscious part of them rather than the unconscious. And those unconscious factors, like being a cold-hearted killer, are suppressed or repressed, and people become, intentionally or unintentionally, unaware of the darkness within them. Unfortunately, modern society actually encourages this process, telling people either to suppress their shadows or, more often, refusing to admit that every person has an active dark side inside of them, saying that human beings are basically good. This idea of the eternal shadow sounds too much like original sin or total depravity, and we hate the idea of being born with a sinful nature. And that just doesn't jive well with positivity, good vibes, and feeling good about yourself. But Jung actually believed that to repress your dark side in this way was far more dangerous than admitting it and even manifesting it. He cited the biblical proverb that pride goes before a fall, arguing that failure to recognize your own flaws not only leads to pride in the first place, thinking that you are better than others, but it also leads to a dangerous unawareness of your own capacity to harm yourself and others. Again, Jung alludes to the New Testament, saying that the inflated person sees the speck or the fault in another person, but cannot see the beam or the major failing in his own eye. And such a person is destined for a fall, which makes sense because if there is an obstruction in your own eye and it's too close for you to see it, then on an intimate level, your very perception of the world is obscured, and we are taken out of touch with our surroundings and even with ourselves. As Jung said, inflation magnifies the blind spot in the eye, and the more we are assimilated by the projection-making factor, the greater becomes the tendency to identify with it. A clear symptom of this is our growing disinclination to take note of the reactions of the environment and pay heed to them. And this last point is incredibly important, because the inflated person fails to properly respond to the environment around him, a symptom which Joker has exhibited from the very beginning. Back at boot camp, he failed to take the environment of boot camp seriously, cracking jokes out of line, until he was put into place by someone stronger, forcing him to become commensurate with the environment of Marine training. And Joker's behavioral divergence shows up again toward the end of the film when his smart comments make even his friend Cowboy snap back at him. They are in a serious situation and everyone needs to act seriously. But Joker is like the class clown who gets a chuckle just often enough to egg him on, but all too often he is still cracking wise when no one is in the mood for it. In fact, it's Joker's hypocritical sarcasm, which the lieutenant is not in the mood for, which gets him sent into the very action that he has been trying to avoid. Though more importantly, Joker doesn't just put his own life at risk, he also gets his photographer, Rafterman, sent into action too, even though Joker was intentionally trying to protect Rafterman by keeping him out of action, which is actually a sign of Joker's light side. But because of Joker's own self-confident glibness, and his inability to see his complicity in other people's faults, and consequently his inability to respond properly to other people, he stumbles into the very thing that his light side does not want. So we can start to see how inflation can be dangerously self-defeating. But the question is, how does a person overcome inflation? So that he is able to see the world more clearly and live in it more wisely. Well, according to Carl Jung, the treatment for inflation requires at least two things. First, a person must become aware of their dark side. He has to make a greater place in his life for what Jung called the dream state. And secondly, one must experience a moral defeat. The two go hand in hand, and it seems that Joker will encounter both. By the end of the film, he will return to the surreal dream state, and within that dream state, he will encounter a moral defeat. But in that defeat, he will achieve greater individuation. The final encounter with the sniper is truly one of the great sequences in any war film. It takes up about the last 25 minutes of the entire film, and in that length of time, it is able to capture both how long and drawn out a single engagement can be, better than a 10-minute scene, but it simultaneously captures how quickly things can happen in an engagement. It's just a matter of minutes from when the squad discovers that they are lost in enemy territory, and they are frozen with indecision, and in a matter of minutes, one of their comrades is gunned down by a sniper, and they are forced to watch helplessly as he is torn apart. The film does an amazing job of conveying this sense of helplessness. Even though the audience sees where the sniper is, we are still able to return to the point of view of the squad. And we still feel like we have no idea where the enemy might attack from. Are they up against only one enemy, or will there be a large-scale ambush? The squad argues, friends are killed, and by the time they organize to hunt the enemy down, the sniper could be anywhere. And I especially love how we go from daylight to nightfall almost imperceptibly within a single sequence. Kubrick said, quote, "One of the things I tried to do was give you a sense of where you were, where everything else was, which in war movies is something you frequently don't get. The terrain of small unit action is really the story of the action, and this is something we tried to make beautifully clear. There's a low wall, and there's the building space. And once you get in there, everything is exactly where it actually was. No cutting away, no cheating. So it came down to where the sniper would be and where the Marines were. When Cowboy is shot, they carry him around the corner to the very most logical shelter. At the climactic moment of the engagement, the remaining men of the squad, including Joker, decide to get revenge for their fallen comrades.
Let's go get some payback.
Okay.
Joker is the one who finds the sniper, who turns out just to be a young girl. Joker's rifle jams, and when the sniper turns around and tries to kill Joker, Joker is saved only when she is gunned down by Rafterman. But she is not killed outright, and Joker raises the question of whether or not they should put her out of her misery. Animal Mother, who is ostensibly in charge, says they should let her suffer.
Let her rot.
However, Joker openly defies this far more imposing man and decides to end her suffering.
I'm just saying we can't leave her like this.
This is a moment where Joker's light side and dark side are in a fever-pitch conflict. He alone seems to believe in some kind of mercy, yet the only way to have mercy is through the horror of shooting a girl in the face, something that only a Jungian shadow could muster the stomach to do. In fact, the same music from the previous shadow scenes is playing on the soundtrack, signaling that we have returned to the archaic dream state, even though our characters are awake. Thus, Joker's coup de grace is an act which fuses his shadow with a higher act of mercy into a single unity, even though this act of mercy may not feel pure. In fact, this is Joker's moral defeat, a defeat which challenges his idea of how people should live, what they should do and what they shouldn't do. And this is what humbles his inflation. As Carl Jung writes, quote, "The world of consciousness must now be leveled down in favor of the reality of the unconscious. In the case of inflation, the presumption of the ego can only be damped down by a moral defeat. This is necessary because otherwise, one will never attain that median degree of modesty which is essential for the maintenance of a balanced state. It is not a question, as one might think, of relaxing morality itself, but of making a moral effort in a different direction. And this is because, quote, the real moral problems spring from conflicts of duty." Jung would use this important term, conflicts of duty, again in A Psychological Approach to the Dogma of the Trinity, saying that, quote, "Individuation is an exceedingly difficult task. It always involves a conflict of duties, whose solution requires us to understand that our counter-will is also an aspect of God's will. One cannot individuate with mere words and convenient self-deception, because there are too many destructive possibilities in the offing. One almost unavoidable danger is that of getting stuck in the conflict and hence in the neurotic dissociation. In other words, in order to become a more complete individual, a person who can adapt and live well in the world around him and avoid a possible neurosis or even physical disaster, Joker must act. He cannot just talk the talk, he must walk the walk. But to act and to individuate, he must do something dark, something unpleasant, something that's even disgusting. As Jung would say again, allowing your shadow side some measure of realization leads to disobedience and self-disgust, but also to self-reliance, without which individuation is unthinkable. The ability to will otherwise must, unfortunately, be real if ethics are to make any sense at all. Anyone who submits to the law from the start, or even to what is generally expected, acts like the man in the parable who buried his talent in the earth. So it's important that Joker has to do something that he does not want to do. If he only wanted to kill, he would be completely shadow. And if he only wanted to submit to what the people around him generally expect, he would never become independent, nor would he be able to rebel against those who want him to do the wrong thing. Obviously, Jung's formula here is not a license for doing something evil just for the sake of your own benefit. There should be a genuine moral duty telling you that you should do something, even if there are desires in you or even other moral standards that make you hesitate. Since we are creatures of light and dark, the path of virtue often lies through feeling, as Jung said, a sense of disgust at ourselves. Carl Jung sketched this excruciating process of becoming an individual in dramatic terms when he described it as a kind of crucifixion, saying that just as Christ was crucified between two thieves, one repentant and the other not, quote, "This great symbol tells us that the progressive development and differentiation of consciousness leads to an ever more menacing awareness of the conflict, and involves nothing less than a crucifixion of the ego, its agonizing suspension between irreconcilable opposites. The individual may strive after perfection. Be you therefore perfect, teleoi, as also your heavenly Father is perfect. But he must suffer from the opposite of his intentions for the sake of his completeness. I find then a law that when I would do good, evil is present with me." The Christ image fully corresponds to this situation. Christ is the perfect man who is crucified. One could hardly think of a truer picture of the goal of ethical endeavor. Metaphorically speaking, Joker both kills and dies, just as Private Pyle killed and died. Yet because Joker has integrated light and dark into himself in a way that Lawrence did not, Joker, again metaphorically, rises to a new kind of life. As the film closes, Joker is still in what seems to be an almost literal hell. Yet he says that he is happy, he is alive, and unlike before, he is not afraid of this hell. Through his shadow, he has become, for the time being, fearless, straightforwardly independent, not gleeful, but happy, acting in tension. Even in the midst of human darkness and desolation, he can sing a song of light and innocence.
M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E. We play fair and we work hard and we're in harmony.
The Mickey Mouse Club song, which soldiers would sometimes march to, is sardonic, no doubt, but it is significant that the shadow can sing the same song as the innocent light. And it even harkens back to the last night on Paris Island.
What is this Mickey Mouse shit?
But it ends on a decisively more positive note. They are in a huge mess, but Joker has adapted to it, and for the time being, he is alive and triumphant. When we are confronted with the darkest nights which life has to offer, a darkness and an evil which will always be waiting for us beyond the horizon, as long as humans have shadows, the best way to come to terms with that darkness and to overcome that evil is with a character that seems both dark and light. In drastic terms, C.S. Lewis argued that the one hope of the world, the only hope for lasting happiness and dignity in human society, is the man who could combine sternness with meekness. Commenting on the medieval ideal of chivalry, he said, quote, "The knight is a man of blood and iron, a man familiar with the sight of smashed faces and the ragged stumps of lopped-off limbs. He is also demure, almost a maiden-like guest in hall, a gentle, modest, unobtrusive man. He is not a compromise or happy mean between ferocity and meekness. He is fierce to the nth and meek to the nth. Without meekness, there is only force and bloodlust. Without ferocity, meek, soft civilizations perish in fire, replaced by industrious invaders. What is needed is not supine vulnerability masquerading as authenticity, or noisy bravado, or calloused numbness, but men who are malleable enough to feel powerfully on the inside, while also coated with something hardened and resistant and unbending, a full metal jacket."